run through first something you're going to have to do on a regular basis. Now, here are some safety precautions that will help keep you and your equipment safe as you go through the process of taking it apart and then putting it back together. You can dodge a chip or scratch off one of the contacts. When handling motherboards and expansion cards, don't touch the chips on boards. Hold expansion cards by the edges. Don't touch any solder components on the card. Don't touch the edge connectors unless it's absolutely necessary. All this helps prevent damage from static electricity. To protect a chip, don't touch it with a magnetized screwdriver. Don't use a graphite pencil to change the dual inline package switch settings, because graphite is a conductor of electricity, and the graphite can lodge in the switch. These on-off switches are used on older motherboards to configure the board. In a classroom environment, after you've reassembled everything and you have your instructor check your work before you put the cover back on, and then power up. Do this so that you don't accidentally fry your motherboard and then cost me and or our classroom a little extra cash. To protect yourself and the equipment when working inside a computer, turn off the power, unplug the computer, and then press the power button to completely drain the power from all the capacitors. Always use a grounding bracelet. Never ever touch the inside of a computer that is turned on. Consider the monitor and the power supply to be black boxes. Never remove the cover or put your hands inside this equipment unless you know about the hazards of charged capacitors and then you've been trained to deal with them. Both the power supply and the monitor can hold a dangerous level of electricity even after you turn them off and disconnect them from a power source. The power supply and monitor contain enough power to kill you even when they are unplugged. When unpacking hardware or software, to help protect against static electricity, remove the packing tape and the cellophane from the work area as soon as possible. To protect against static electricity, keep components away from your hair and clothing. Now that you know about PC technician tools and how to keep safe, now let's look at the steps to taking apart a computer. Now, a PC technician needs to be comfortable with taking apart a computer and putting it back together. And in most situations, the essential tools that you're going to need for the job are a ground bracelet, a Phillips head screwdriver, a flathead screwdriver, paper, and a pen. And as you work inside a computer, be sure to use the ground bracelet. The safety precautions in the chapter and the guidelines in the following list. If you are starting with a working computer, make sure important data is first backed up. Copy the data to an external storage device such as a flash drive or an external hard drive. How to perform a good backup will be covered later on in our lessons. Power down the system, unplug it and press the power button. Unplug the monitor, mouse, keyboard, and any other peripherals or cables attached, and then move them out of your way. Put the computer on a table with plenty of room. Have a plastic bag or a cup handy to hold screws. When you reassemble the PC, you'll need to insert the same screws in the same holes. This is especially important with the hard drive because screws that are too long could puncture the hard drive housing. Now, sometimes I think figuring out how to open a computer case is the most difficult part of disassembling. If you need help figuring it out, check the user manual or the website of the case manufacturer. To remove the cover of your PC, do the following. Many newer cases require you to remove the faceplate of the front of the case first. Other cases require you to remove a side panel first. And really older computer cases require you to first remove the entire sides and the top as a single unit. Study your case for the correct approach. Most cases have panels on each side of the case that can be removed. It is usually necessary to only remove one panel to expose the top of the motherboard. To know which panel to remove, look at where the ports are on the rear of the case. For example, as the display behind me, if the ports on the motherboard are on the left side of the case, indicating the bottom of the motherboard is on the left. Therefore, you want to remove the right panel to expose the top of the motherboard. Lay the case down to its left so that the ports on the motherboard are sitting on the bottom. Later, depending on how the drives are installed, it might become necessary to remove the bottom panel in order to remove the screws that hold the drives in place. Locate the screws that hold the side panel in place. Be careful not to unscrew any screws beside these. The other screws probably are for holding on the power supply, the fan, and other components in place. After the screws are removed, slide the panel toward the rear and then lift it off the case. Newer cases require you to pop the front panel off the case before removing the side panels. Look for a lever on the bottom of the panel and hinges at the top. Squeeze the lever to release the front panel and then lift it off the case. Then remove a single screw and slide the side panel to the front and then off the case. Also, note that some case panels don't use screws. These side panels simply pop up and out with a little prying and pulling. If you plan to remove several components, draw a diagram of all cable connections to the motherboard, adapter cards, and drives that you might need, because you might need this cable connection diagram to help you reassemble things. Or you can do what most people do today, break out that cell phone and snap yourself a picture. But make sure your lighting is good and that you're actually taking pictures of the connections themselves. You want to be able to look back on this photograph later, even if it's in a couple of days, and say, ah yes, that goes there, or this goes here. Note where each cable begins and where each one ends. Pay attention to the small wires and connectors that connect the front of the case to the motherboard. It's important to be careful about diagramming these because it's so easy to connect into the wrong position later on when you're reassembling. And if you want, use a felt tip marker to make a mark across the components to indicate a cable connection, board placement, motherboard orientation, speaker connection, brackets, and so on, so that you can simply just line up the marks later on when you reassemble. Remember, it's usually dark inside that case, so try to take good notes on where you're putting things. This method, however, probably won't work in the front case wires because they're so small. For these, consider writing down the color of the wires and their position on the pins, or look up the manufacturer's diagrams on their website. Also, this is a good opportunity to break out your cell phone and get a really good picture of how the front wiring connections actually are put into place. Most of them are typically standard in the way they're wired, but every once in a while you do end up with that motherboard that's a little different. Now, the drives are connected to the motherboard with ribbon cables or a thinner serial ATA cable. Before removing any ribbon cables, look for a red color or stripe down the side of each cable. Now, this edge color marks the side of the cable as what we call pin 1. Look on the board or drive that the cable is attached to. You should see that pin 1 or pin 2 is clearly marked. However, some boards mark pin 34 or pin 40. For these boards, pin 1 is on the other side of the connector. Now, also know that some boards and drives don't mark the pins, but rather have a notch in the connector, or what we call a key. So that notched ribbon cable can only be inserted in one direction. Verify that the edge color is aligned with pin 1. A good rule of thumb when you're connecting your drives is that ribbon cable, that line, that red line, always goes closest to the power supply on the drive. That's just a rule of thumb, and it's a rule of thumb that does not apply to floppy disks. Serial ATA cables can only connect to serial ATA connectors in one direction, so you really got to push pretty hard to screw that one up. The notch on the side of the floppy drive connector allows the floppy drive cable to connect in only one direction. And that, believe it or not, is only on the newer or more recent floppy drives. The older, old style floppies, you had to pretty much guess. And it was very common that you screwed that up. I have found in many cases that the floppy drives were actually the complete opposite of the regular hard drives or CD IDE drives, whereas the red line in the cable was actually furthest away from the power supply. But it's up to you really to figure out which one which one it goes into. You'll find out every time, and if it doesn't work or doesn't see it, guess what? You got it wrong. Also, in most cases with your floppy drive, if you power the machine on and there's no disk in the drive and the light stays on, chances are you have your ribbon cable plugged in backwards. Well, something to look for. Now, a system might have up to 3 types of ribbon cables. Floppy drive cable is 34 pins and a twist in the cable. IDE cables have 40 pins. CD or DVD drives can use either a 40-pin conductor IDE cable or a higher quality 80-pin conductor IDE cable. Older hard drives use an 80 conductor IDE ribbon cable. Newer drives use a SATA cable rather than a ribbon cable. Remove the cables to all the drives. Remove the power supply cords from the drives. Notice as you disconnect the power cord, the mullet connector is shaped so it only connects in one direction also. Do the following to remove the expansion cards. Remove any wire ribbon cable connected to the card. Remove the screw holding the card to the case. Grasp the card with both hands and remove it by lifting it straight up. If you have trouble removing it from the expansion slot, you can very slightly rock the card from end to end. Do not rock the card side to side. Rocking the card from side to side might spread the slot opening and then weaken the connection, and then would give you intermittent problems with your card. As you remove the card, do not put your fingers on the edge connectors or touch any of the chips as best as you can, and don't stack the cards on top of one another. Lay each card aside on a flat surface, or better yet, put it into an anti-static bag. Note that some video cards may use a latch that helps hold the card into place. To remove these cards, use one finger to hold the latch back from the slot, and then as you pull the card up and out of the slot, you can release the notch. Depending on the system, you might need to remove the motherboard next, or remove the drives next. My choice is to first remove the motherboard. It and the processor are the most expensive and easily damaged parts in this system. I like to get them out of the harm's way before working with the drives. However, in some cases, you have to remove the drives first, or you have to remove the power supply. Because of the way that the motherboard is situated, it may be tucked underneath those drives, and you don't want to damage any of the chips on trying to get the motherboard out first. To remove the motherboard, unplug the power supply lines to the motherboard. You'll find a main power line and maybe one auxiliary power line from the power supply to the motherboard. There might also be an audio wire from the CD drive to the motherboard. Disconnect it from the board, and then the next step is to disconnect the wires leading from the front of the computer case to the motherboard. If you don't have the motherboard manual handy, be very careful to diagram how these wires connect. Use your cell phone here to take a picture. Make a careful diagram and then disconnect the wires. The graphic behind me shows 5 leads and the pins on the motherboard that receive these leads. The pins are color-coded and cryptically labeled on the board. You'll learn more about matching these wires to their connectors later on. Okay, we're now ready to remove the screws that hold the motherboard to the case. For older motherboards, instead of screws, you might see spacers that keep the board from resting directly on the bottom of the computer case. Carefully pop off these spacers and remove the screws. It can be up to 9 screws, depending on the type of board that we have. And then remove the board. Set it aside in a safe place. In many cases, I would suggest if you have the ability, then please go ahead and use an anti-static bag. Okay. One spacer, typically one spacer would be lying beside the case in its holes just to support the motherboard from flexing and touching the case. The motherboard should now be free, and you can carefully remove it from the case. To remove the power supply from the case, look for screws and attach the power supply to the case. Be careful not to remove any screws that hold the power supply housing together. You don't want to take the housing apart. Now, after you've removed the screws, the power supply still might not be free. Sometimes it's attached to the case by the underside by recessed slots. Turn the case over, look on the bottom for these slots. If they are present, determine in which direction you need to slide the power supply free to remove from the case. I've worked on cases in the past where I've actually had to push a little lever down and then slide the power supply out of the case that way. Next, we want to remove each drive. Now handle the drives with care. Here are some tips. Some drives have 1 or 2 screws on each side of the drive attaching the drive to the drive bay. After you remove the screws, the drive slides to the front or to the rear and then out of the case. Sometimes there's a catch underneath the drive that you have to lift up as you slide the drive forward. Some drive bays have a clipping mechanism to hold the drive in place. First release the clip and then pull the drive forward and then out of the case. Handle these drives with care. Some cases have a removable bay for smaller drives. These bays can hold narrow drives such as hard drives, floppy drives, and or zip drives. The bay is removed first and then the drives are removed from the bay. To remove the bay, first remove the screws or release the clip holding the bay in place and then slide the bay out of the case. These drives are usually installed in the bay with 2 screws on each side. Remove the screws and then remove the drives. And wham! You've got the computer taken apart. Well, if you can take it apart, then I guess you got to be able to put it back together. To reassemble the computer, basically all you got to do is do everything in reverse. Install the components in the case in this particular order, if you can. Power supply, drives, motherboard, and then the cards. When installing drives, know that for some systems, it's easier to connect the data cables to the drives and then slide the drives into the bay. If the drive is anchored to the bay with screws, be careful to align the front of the drive flush with the front of the case before installing the screws. Nothing's going to annoy your customer more when they look at their nice new computer and the CD drive is sitting out about 1/8 of an inch. It just looks unprofessional. Connect all the data and power cables before you replace the cover. Take a few minutes to double check each connection to make sure it is correct and snug. Plug in the keyboard monitor and mouse. In our environment, have your instructor check the work before you power it up. Like I said before, make sure that everything is put together properly so we don't fry things. Just a couple of years ago, I had a student who didn't have the memory modules in all the way. There was literally a spark, a little bit of smoke, and not only did it fry the memory chip, but it also fried the motherboard itself. After we've gone through and we've checked all the connections, let's turn on the power and check that the PC is working properly. If the PC does not work, most likely the problem is a loose connection. Turn off the power and go back and double check all your cable connections. If that floppy drive light is lit up and there's no disk in place, check to make sure your cable is in correctly. It's probably backwards.